What if the history humanity has believed for nearly 2 millennia is incomplete? What if, buried beneath centuries of doctrine and silence, lies a forbidden truth so dangerous it could shatter the foundations of faith, topple thrones, and challenge the very power the Church has built? A question echoes through the quiet halls of history, capable of overturning conventional understanding. What if Jesus of Nazareth left behind daughters? Exploring these questions inevitably leads to whispers history has tried to silence, and to the discovery of fragments seemingly destined never to be forgotten. This is not about symbols or allegories, but about flesh and blood, daughters born into a world utterly unprepared to acknowledge them. These potential heiresses, it is hypothesized, carried in their veins both the dust of humanity and the breath of divinity, representing the living embodiment of the greatest mystery. To imagine for a moment what such a truth might mean is to realize that the faith known today was shaped not only by what was remembered, but also by what was meticulously erased. In the long corridors of cathedrals and synods, such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where key Christian dogmas were established, and subsequent ecclesiastical gatherings, the story of Christ was narrowed, trimmed, and sculpted until it became the one recognized by the modern world. Every inconvenient fragment, every potential mention of a family or direct descendants, was quietly buried under layers of dogma, creating a canonical version that excluded such unorthodox ideas. Yet, the whispers persist. They seep through the cracks of forbidden texts, among them apocryphal gospels such as the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip, discovered in the Nag Hammadi library in the mid-20th century, dating to approximately the 4th century CE. These texts, rejected by the official church at councils like Laodicea, circa 363 CE, or the Third Council of Carthage, 397 CE, often contain elements that did not fit the emerging Orthodox canon, including potential mentions of familial ties beyond the conventional picture. The whisper of a bloodline, not just of kings or prophets, but of daughters, hidden children whose very existence would threaten to shift the balance of power, continued to live on in legends and symbols. Why would daughters, rather than sons, pose such a threat? In the ancient world, a daughter was both invisible and unstoppable. Her name could be erased from official records, her face absent from chronicles. Yet, through her womb, the lineage would continue unbroken, becoming a hidden thread silently woven into history. This was a secret heritage that could not be eradicated, even when her name was struck from the pages of memory, as the physical continuation of the line could exist independently of official history. Some researchers suggest this is precisely why the early church so deeply feared this idea. To acknowledge that Jesus had daughters would be to admit that his divine authority was not limited to scripture or sacrament, but lived in the flesh, walking among people, passed through the veins of women who could not be controlled. Such a lineage could undermine the authority of the emerging hierarchy, as living descendants could claim a different form of spiritual legacy. And so, if they existed, the daughters had to be erased not only by violence, but by silence, the most effective form of oblivion. Removing their names, omitting their stories, sowing doubt about their existence, all of this would lead the world to eventually forget. But memory is never entirely lost. Here and there, a faint trace remains. Perhaps it's an image carved in stone, as some researchers interpret hidden symbols in early Christian art and catacombs. Perhaps it's a tale whispered among heretics, whose teachings were preserved in secret communities for centuries. Or it's a symbol drawn in the folds of a Madonna's robe, as some art historians suggest, analyzing hidden meanings in Renaissance works. Each clue is fragile, each fragment disputed, but together they form the outline of a story that refuses to disappear, continuing to stir minds to this day. Could it be that the true Holy Grail was never a golden chalice, as often depicted in popular cultures and novels, but was a bloodline of daughters carrying sacred blood? Could it be that, even now, somewhere in the forgotten genealogies of Europe, in the blood of ancient dynasties, or in the lives of those who never knew the weight of their heritage, the daughters of Christ continue to live? No one can say with certainty, but exploring these questions leads to shadowy places where memory and myth intertwine, where history refracts into mystery, and where the question still awaits an answer beneath centuries of silence. What if the greatest secret was not that Christ lived, but that his daughters survived? If Christ left a family, where did they go? History, as is known, is written by those who remain in power, and power often prefers to forget what does not serve it. A lineage descended from Jesus, especially one passed through daughters, would pose an existential threat to the early church, whose authority was based on the idea that salvation could only come through priests, bishops, and popes. But a bloodline, that was something they could not control. A living heir, a bearer of sacred blood, would not need Rome's permission to claim spiritual or even temporal power. Their very existence would challenge the Church's monopoly on divine mediation. One can imagine a woman, a potential daughter of Christ, standing in a town square, her mere existence a refutation of the power structure built in his name. Her blood would be her gospel, her body a vessel of an unbreakable covenant. And so the main question arises: if they existed, what happened to them after the crucifixion and ascension? Some ancient traditions and apocryphal texts whisper of exile. The family may have been secretly taken from the Holy Land, spirited across the Mediterranean by loyal followers who knew that Jerusalem, after the destruction of the Temple in 70 CE and subsequent persecutions of Christians, was no longer safe. Perhaps they disappeared into obscurity in distant lands, such as Gaul, modern France, Britain, or even more eastern regions. Their names were changed, their history silenced, until the world no longer remembered who they truly were, a classic strategy of concealment in history. But oblivion, as has been said, is never complete. Just as the tide leaves fragments of shells on the sand, history leaves behind fragments of truth, waiting for their moment to be discovered. Apocryphal Gospels, those very texts declared heretical and locked away for many centuries, sometimes hint at a bloodline quietly continuing through unnamed figures. These lines, like faint traces repeatedly erased by official history, still remain visible to those who know how to look and interpret hidden meanings. And in the medieval world, especially from the 12th to 13th centuries, this idea reappeared in whispers and codes, in legends that at first glance seemed like simple chivalric tales. Grail legends, for instance, speak not only of mystical cups granting immortality or healing, but also of bloodlines, of sang-real, royal blood, which many interpret as referring to descendants of Christ. Perhaps through the Merovingians or other European dynasties, creating a complex labyrinth of myth and history that still sparks fervent debate among historians and theologians. Some researchers suggest that what was truly sought was not an artifact, but rather a family line, descendants so carefully hidden from view that only encrypted symbols could reveal them. The question arises, why did this line have to disappear so tracelessly? The answer lies in the realities of the ancient Mediterranean, where lineage was the cornerstone of all social order. Kings ascended to the throne based on birthright. Priests asserted their power by claiming descent from ancient prophets, and entire dynasties rose or fell, drawing strength from their blood. Acknowledging that Jesus might have left behind daughters would inevitably lead to the conclusion that his divine legacy did not end with his martyrdom on the cross. It would continue, pulsating in blood, embodied in bodies, flowing through the hidden veins of generations. For church hierarchs, such a thought was utterly unthinkable. Their own claim was to be the sole, exclusive vessel of divine authority. However, a living bloodline of Christ would completely circumvent this monopoly. No clergyman, no bishop, no pope could ever hope to rival the undeniable authority of one who carried the same blood as the Savior himself. Thus, this potentially dangerous story was erased from the annals. Church councils unanimously rejected any texts that even hinted at Christ's human essence, his family, or possible heirs. These writings were ruthlessly condemned as heresy, their authors silenced, and the communities that followed these teachings annihilated. The daughters, if they were destined to live, dissolved into the silent shadows of time. And yet, even shadows leave faint outlines. What if their descendants became the unnamed spouses of kings, the quiet, unnoticed mothers of noble dynasties? What if their names were preserved not as direct daughters of Christ, but as forgotten figures buried in the complex genealogies of European aristocratic families? Their sacred secret was passed down from generation to generation in deep silence. The disappearance of a bloodline, paradoxically, is not absolute proof of its absence. On the contrary, in this case, it may serve as the greatest of all proofs. For what power could be stronger than a truth so dangerous that it had to be completely wiped from the face of the earth? And so we are left with a faint whisper. Perhaps Christ's bloodline was never completely destroyed. Perhaps it was merely carefully hidden, patiently awaiting the moment when the world would rediscover what was once strictly forbidden. If there is a figure in the New Testament that looms like a shadow on the very edge of a great mystery, it is undoubtedly Mary Magdalene. For some, she was a repentant sinner, a woman saved from darkness by Christ's grace. For others, she was an apostle to the apostles, the one entrusted with the first revelation of the resurrection itself. Yet, beneath these contradictory images lies another role, whispered in heretical texts, hinted at in ancient legends, and perhaps too dangerous for the Church to permit: the role of wife, mother, and keeper of a sacred bloodline. The canonical Gospels offer very sparse information about her. They relegate Magdalene to a mere follower, a witness, a background figure whose significance briefly flickers at the tomb before disappearing again. But the Gospels that were rejected, the so-called Apocrypha, speak with a completely different voice. In the Gospel of Philip, a text buried for centuries before its rediscovery at Nag Hammadi, Magdalene is described not merely as a disciple, but as one whom Christ loved more than all others, one whom he often kissed. Rumors suggest that the other apostles were jealous of her extraordinary intimacy with the teacher. Some scholars are inclined to dismiss this description as a simple metaphor, indicating spiritual closeness. However, others ask a question the Church never wished to hear aloud. Was it something more? If Christ and Magdalene were bound in a sacred union, then she may have been not merely a witness to his life, but the true vessel of his continuation, a mother carrying the future of his lineage in her womb. This single possibility radically changes our entire understanding. For centuries, Magdalene was depicted either as a sinner or as a saint, but very rarely as a partner. The role of wife, consort, would have made her a central figure in the entire story, the very axis around which his legacy could revolve. And if she had borne his children, if she had borne his daughters, then her erasure from history would not merely be an act of misogyny. It would have been an absolute necessity. Just imagine how different the world would look if her story had been preserved. Imagine a Christianity that honored not only the divine masculine, but also the divine feminine, embodied in the union of Christ and Magdalene, passed down to daughters who would represent both the continuation of his blood and the sacred power of womanhood. But history took a different path. Instead, Magdalene was reinterpreted as a repentant prostitute, a figure of shame, not of power or significance. This image, though never mentioned in the Bible itself, was actively preached by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century and became firmly entrenched in Christian tradition. With just one sermon, her potential role as partner and mother was buried under centuries of stigma and condemnation. Yet, she never disappeared completely. In the south of France, legends are still passed down about a woman who arrived by boat, carrying whispers of holiness. She is said to have lived in the caves of Provence, weeping and praying until her death. But some versions of this story add a crucial detail that the Church preferred to omit. She did not come alone. She arrived with a child, a daughter, or perhaps more than one. If this is true, then Mary Magdalene's role was not merely to witness Christ's resurrection. It was to continue the Savior's very life, hidden in the veins of her children. The Church may have buried her story, but in the hills of France, in the symbols of the Black Madonna, and in the coded legends of the Grail, the mystery has been preserved. Was she a sinner, a saint, or the mother of a hidden bloodline? Perhaps she was all three, woven into a story too dangerous to survive the pen of official history, but too powerful to be entirely forgotten. Considering the central role Magdalene is presumed to have played, a natural question arises. Why do official historical records maintain such persistent silence? Perhaps the answer lies not so much in what was recorded on parchment, but in what was deliberately omitted and left without written testimony. The early Christian Church was by no means an impartial chronicler of events, or a neutral keeper of collective memory. It was an emerging, dynamically developing institution, actively engaged in building its own power, forming dogmatic foundations, and determining whose name would be preserved for centuries and who would be consigned to oblivion. In this process, silence proved to be its most powerful and effective tool. During the first centuries following Christ's death, Christian communities were extraordinarily diverse, often fragmented, and frequently in a state of internal contradiction. Some followers adhered to the notion of a purely spiritual Christ, perceiving him as a divine being entirely impervious to earthly needs of the flesh. Others, on the contrary, emphasized his human essence, his blood, his blood ties, and family connections. In the context of these competing theological visions, the idea of Christ as a husband and father did not seem unthinkable or unacceptable at all. Such stories were merely part of a vast circle of narratives widely circulating in the ancient Mediterranean. However, as the Church began the process of consolidating its power, such alternative histories started to pose a serious threat to its emerging authority. At significant gatherings like the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where bishops from all corners of the empire convened by imperial decree to determine the future of Christianity, unity and uniformity were valued far above historical truth. Texts that contradicted the chosen and approved narrative were condemned and rejected. Writings that spoke too much about Magdalene, too openly hinted at the existence of hidden heirs, were declared heretical and ruthlessly cast aside. By silencing the very possibility of Christ having a family, the Church thereby secured something fundamental: its exclusivity and monopoly on spiritual authority. Power, in its conviction, could not belong to invisible and, most importantly, uncontrollable daughters or descendants. It had to be invariably transmitted through a hierarchical structure consisting of bishops, popes, and priests, exclusively men who dedicated themselves to mediating between heaven and earth. But this enforced silence, as it turned out, was not absolutely perfect. Here and there, through the dense veil of oblivion, faint, barely perceptible echoes of another, hidden truth were preserved. The Gospel of Mary, a text discovered in a papyrus codex, presents Magdalene not merely as a follower, but as a teacher of a hidden wisdom, one who comforts and instructs the disciples after the crucifixion. She utters words possessing undeniable power and authority. However, Peter openly challenges her right to this, insistently asserting that Christ would never have revealed such mysteries to a woman. The text itself breaks off mid-scene, leaving us to wonder what else might have been excised or deliberately omitted. What else might have been said about her true role? This silence was certainly not accidental. It was a carefully planned strategy. To completely erase a truth so threatening to the established order, it was not enough simply to deny its existence. It was necessary to replace it with something else. And that is why Magdalene's image was radically reinterpreted. From then on, she ceased to be a teacher of secret wisdom, ceased to be a possible partner of Christ. Instead, she became a repentant sinner. Her name became forever inextricably linked with shame and repentance. The Church's silence on this matter was deafening, and yet, the more fiercely and persistently this silence was enforced, the more curious and noticeable became the gaps and absences it sought to conceal. Why did it take so much effort to erase a certain version of history? Why was there such persistence in promoting only one interpretation of her fate? Could it be that this very silence is irrefutable proof? Proof that the truth was not merely forgotten over time, but deliberately and meticulously hidden. In the secret corners of monasteries, barely audible whispers may have been preserved. In remote lost villages, ancient legends were probably told by firelight. In symbols carved in stone, painted in frescoes, and whispered in secret societies. The possibility of Christ's daughters was preserved, awaiting the day when Rome's silence would finally be broken. For silence, by its very nature, is never eternal. It can conceal, suppress, bury, but it cannot ultimately destroy. Somewhere deep beneath the ashes of forgotten texts and the unbearable weight of dogmatic teachings, the story of Christ's hidden bloodline continues to live, maintaining its unseen presence. If Rome took every possible measure to silence this story, where can we still catch its faintest echoes? These echoes are found in the Apocrypha, in those Gospels that were rejected, declared heretical, and carefully hidden from public view. These are voices that managed to seep through the tiniest cracks of orthodoxy, fragile in nature, yet incredibly persistent, whispering of possibilities the Church dared not canonize and include in the official corpus of sacred texts. The Gospel of Mary is one such remarkable text. In it, Magdalene is presented not merely as an ordinary follower, but as a person capable of comforting and instructing other disciples. Peter, however, openly resists her authority, asking, "Did he truly speak privately with a woman and not openly with us?" Her role in this context is that of a leader endowed with a special closeness and intimacy with the teacher, unequivocally hinting at something far greater than just a teacher-student relationship. The Gospel of Philip goes even further in its revelations. It describes Magdalene as Christ's companion, loved by him more than all others. The text explicitly states that he often kissed her and mentions the apostles' jealousy, who wondered why she was shown such exceptional preference. Were these relationships purely spiritual? Perhaps. But then the question arises, why the jealousy? Why is it so insistently claimed that she received revelations unavailable to others? These texts do not directly name daughters, but in their gaps, in their silence, in their metaphors. Some researchers and interpreters hear the subtlest, barely perceptible hint of a family's existence. If Magdalene was indeed a companion, if she was loved more than all others, then it is not excluded that she could also have been a mother. The word companion in its original language carries deep meanings of intimacy, partnership, and even marital connection. Other apocryphal works, such as the Acts of Philip, the Gospel of the Hebrews, and Pistis Sophia, tell allegories and fragments, invariably elevating Magdalene and always hinting at a degree of closeness that could not be completely erased from historical memory. However, the most striking and significant echo lies not so much in what these texts explicitly state, but in what they refuse to utter aloud. Why do these ancient writings so fiercely and persistently preserve Magdalene's authority? Why do they present her as one entrusted with secrets that other disciples perhaps could not bear? Could it be that these texts are merely shadows of a much greater truth, indicating that she bore not only teachings, but also children? Apocryphal texts posed a serious threat to the developing church doctrine precisely because they not only allowed for, but actively supported, a certain highly undesirable possibility. In their traditions and narratives, these manuscripts carefully preserved the image of Mary Magdalene as a key, deeply personal, and highly authoritative figure in Jesus' inner circle. If at that time anyone had openly recognized her as Christ's companion, singled out among all disciples for special love and closeness, the next logical and very disturbing question would inevitably arise: did they have a family? Such a supposition was absolutely unacceptable to the early Christian church, and for this reason, the invaluable Apocrypha were decisively consigned to oblivion and destruction. Numerous manuscripts, once carefully hidden in deserted desert caves, and texts publicly burned in bustling town squares, along with the communities that dared to value and study this knowledge, were declared heretical and ruthlessly annihilated in the merciless flames of religious persecution. History, however, teaches that perfect silence is an unattainable illusion. The momentous discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in 1945, and later the Dead Sea Scrolls in subsequent decades, flung open long bolted doors to long-forgotten worlds. And now, centuries later, the previously stifled whispers began to sound again, penetrating through the thick layers of time. The newly found hidden voices began to tell of Magdalene's truly unique role, her exceptional closeness to the teacher, her undeniable authority among his followers. And behind all these revelations invariably loomed an unspoken, yet profound question. Did she leave behind something more tangible than just spiritual teachings? Did she have daughters? Although the Apocrypha do not provide a direct and unambiguous answer, in their scattered fragments, in torn lines and lost pages, they leave enough suggestive silence for deep reflection, enough ample space for imagination to fill it with the possibilities that the official church once dared not accept and preserve. It is possible that this very absence of mention, this informational vacuum, is not merely a coincidence, but a powerful echo of long-past events. Perhaps the greatest and most compelling evidence of all lies, not in what was carefully recorded and preserved, but rather in what was deliberately and meticulously erased from historical memory. If we assume that Mary Magdalene indeed carried Christ's precious bloodline, a logical question arises. Where might she have sought refuge? Initially, the Holy Land, engulfed in incessant conflicts and cruel persecutions, could never have provided safety for a woman and her potential children. This is why ancient legends tell of her desperate flight, a long and dangerous sea journey, leading her away from turbulent Jerusalem to the harsh but promising shores of southern Gaul. The story, like a gentle breeze, whispers throughout Provence, where some villages still bear echoes of her name in their titles and traditions. In the small town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, local legend vividly paints a picture of a tiny boat, devoid of sails and oars, carrying Mary Magdalene, her faithful companions, and in some of the most intriguing versions, a child. Abandoned to the mercy of the relentless waves, they are said to have reached the salt marshes of France, a place both wild and desolate, yet deeply sacred, where exiles could reliably disappear into obscurity, finding much-needed shelter. It is in these lands that her unseen presence is still felt today, etched in ancient stone and in numerous oral traditions. The grotto of Saint-Baume, located high in the picturesque mountains, is revered as a sanctuary where, according to belief, Mary Magdalene spent her last earthly years. Pilgrims still make the difficult ascent along its rocky path, humbly whispering prayers in the very silence where she is said to have prayed and shed tears. However, a profound question arises. What exactly was she weeping about? Were these tears of repentance, as the Church traditionally teaches, or was it the heavy burden of a great secret, too significant to be uttered aloud? Local traditions insist that Magdalene did not arrive in these parts alone. She was accompanied by sisters in faith, loyal companions, and perhaps someone even more intimate. Some boldly declare that she carried a daughter in her arms, her child by Christ, whose descendants would later merge with influential and noble families of southern France, their sacred bloodline remaining hidden in plain sight among the region's noble lords and ladies. In this unique landscape, the memory of such events is often embedded in symbols. Thus, the Black Madonnas of Provence, mysterious statues of dark-skinned mothers with infants, have been strongly linked by some researchers to the image of Magdalene. Their hidden message is perceived as a subtle reminder of a mother who carried sacred blood into distant exile. But why did France become this refuge? Perhaps the reason lies in the fact that ancient Gaul was significantly distant from the all-seeing eye and powerful hand of Rome, representing a frontier territory where exiles could exist relatively freely without constant and burdensome oversight. Another version suggests that potential allies were already waiting there, secret communities deeply sympathetic to her presence, her message, and most importantly, her supposed bloodline. Or perhaps this land, located on the very edge of the then Roman Empire, was simply destined to become the cradle for the birth and development of a secret dynasty. Legends possess an amazing vitality, for they never completely fade, only transforming and passing from mouth to mouth. Throughout Provence, magnificent churches dedicated to Magdalene still stand today, and numerous festivals annually celebrate her mysterious arrival by sea. And invariably, against the backdrop of these vibrant festivities, the same pressing question remains. Was she merely a saint, humbly repenting in solitude, or was she a mother who brought with her the daughters of Christ, whose true essence was skillfully concealed beneath the dense layers of myth? Exile, as history shows, is never merely an act of fleeing persecution. It is also a powerful mechanism of preservation, a way to safeguard something precious. By disappearing into the wild, inaccessible hills of France, Magdalene and her children, if they indeed existed, ensured that the sacred bloodline would not be broken or perish in the wave of violence that engulfed Jerusalem. It would continue its quiet existence in the fertile valleys of Europe, skillfully woven into the complex tapestry of families who perhaps never even realized the full significance of the treasure they had inherited. And thus, this ancient whisper continues to live. Southern France proved to be not just a temporary refuge for her. It became the true cradle for a legacy that the official church, despite all its efforts, was never able to completely erase from memory. If Mary Magdalene indeed carried Christ's bloodline into exile, what tangible reminders might she have left behind for future generations? In numerous churches and ancient chapels of France, Spain, and Italy, mysterious statues, widely known as Black Madonnas, still stand today. These dark-skinned figures of the Virgin and Child, clad in gold-shimmering robes and shrouded in shadow, gaze upon the world with stern yet surprisingly gentle eyes. For many centuries, these images served as objects of deep veneration, invariably attracting countless pilgrims who knelt before them and lit candles at their feet. But what if their meaning extends far beyond a simple depiction of the Virgin Mary? Some researchers and thinkers believe that these mysterious figures conceal an entirely different, deeper history. Their characteristic darkness, it is argued, is not merely an artistic device or the result of years of candle smoke, but rather a powerful symbol, a veiled reference to Mary Magdalene and her profound role as the mother of a sacred bloodline. In stark contrast to the pale and delicate images of Madonnas created during the Renaissance, The Black Madonnas appear rooted in the very earth, their presence seeming primordial, almost predating Christianity itself. What if their true purpose was to subtly remind believers of a profound truth that the official church so diligently sought to erase from collective memory? That Christ's legacy continued not only through spiritual teaching and sacred sacraments, but also through the earthly womb of a woman who, perhaps, bore his children. It is noteworthy that it is in Provence, where tradition holds Magdalene spent her last years, that such statues are found with the greatest frequency. For centuries, pilgrims have invariably associated these enigmatic images with miraculous phenomena, healings, and divine protection, as if the women depicted in stone or wood possessed a hidden power passed down through generations. The question arises, could this mysterious power be an echo of the memory of a once concealed bloodline? The Black Madonna also embodies the sacred feminine, that very essence long persecuted and forgotten in Western spiritual tradition. Her silent presence seems to whisper of times when the divine was perceived not only as a powerful father, but also as an all-encompassing mother, not merely as a regal figure, but as a life-giving womb. Her placement at the very heart of Christian worship may have been a quiet act of defiance, a way to carefully preserve what could not be spoken aloud without fear of consequence. And always, she gently holds a child in her arms, a child whose identity, perhaps, is not unique. For, although the official church stubbornly insists that every Madonna and child symbolizes the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ, other interpretations open up another possibility. Perhaps in some cases, this child represents the daughters of Christ, whose lineage was passed down through Magdalene. It is probable that these statues encode not one, but two parallel stories: the story of the Virgin who gave birth to God, and the story of the companion who gave him heirs. But why are they black? Some researchers argue that their dark color serves as a link to older, pre-Christian traditions, to the great goddesses of Egypt and the Near East, whose images were often dark, symbolizing fertility, deep mystery, and the fertile soil of the earth itself. Others see in this a deliberate veil, a clever way to hide the truth in plain sight. Depicting Magdalene as a Black Madonna may have been a kind of code, a symbol understood only by those initiated into the legend of her exile. The Church, while tolerant of their existence, does so with noticeable unease. For centuries, theologians have fiercely debated their meaning, often reducing them to simple curiosities, offering various explanations for their origin. Yet, believers continue to light candles at their feet, whisper sacred prayers, and carry away a feeling that these figures mean something far more than official doctrine allows. The Black Madonnas remain silent and vigilant, guardians of a mystery that refuses to die. They stand as dark witnesses, carved in stone and wood, perhaps reminding us that Christ's daughters were never completely erased from history, but merely skillfully hidden in symbols that the Church could not fully control or interpret at will. If Magdalene indeed carried her bloodline to France, who then ensured its survival in subsequent centuries, exile alone would clearly have been insufficient. A mother and her daughters, even if hidden in caves or protected by loyal believers, would have required constant and powerful protection. And so legends tell of guardians, local dynasties, influential noble families, and secret allies who absorbed this bloodline into their own, subtly weaving the sacred blood into the very fabric of European society. In the rugged yet picturesque hills of Occitania, where the heretical Cathar community once flourished, whispers still circulate about families who trace their lineage back to Magdalene's companions. These lords and ladies, often at odds with Rome, seemed almost destined by fate to protect a secret that threatened the very foundations of the Christian Church. Is it possible that they were not merely rebels, but guardians of an ancient and dangerous heritage? This idea does not seem so far-fetched. In a world where power and legitimacy were measured by bloodlines, the most reliable way to protect Christ's descendants would have been to merge his heirs with noble European houses. In marriage contracts and carefully compiled genealogical scrolls, the divine blood could be hidden from prying eyes, yet carefully preserved for future generations. What began as an exile would, after several generations, transform into a subtle influence. The royal courts of Europe quietly carried Christ's blood, never speaking its name aloud, lest they incur the wrath of the Church. This possibility raises deeply unsettling questions. Did the kings and queens of medieval Europe unconsciously inherit a bloodline that originated in distant Galilee? Were solemn coronations, accompanied by prayers for divine right to the throne, actually rooted in something far more ancient and sacred? In a hidden inheritance that granted legitimacy not through papal blessing, but through birth itself. Some ancient traditions point to the Merovingians, the legendary long-haired kings of the Franks, whose rule spanned from the 5th to the 8th century. They were said to possess mystical power, healing abilities, and a special aura of divine right that no pope could bestow. Could their extraordinary power have come not from myths and legends, but from their very blood? The blood passed down from Magdalene and her daughters into their lineage. If this is true, then these guardians were not merely political figures. They were keepers of memory, entrusted with a secret too dangerous for the world to know. Their task was not only to preserve wealth and land holdings, but also to protect a bloodline whose survival meant that Christ's legacy was not limited to Scripture alone. It was living, breathing, continuing through the flesh and bone of real people. And who else could have played such an important role? The Knights Templar, centuries later, were rumored to have discovered ancient genealogies, mysterious relics, and even living heirs connected to this bloodline. Their sudden and unexplained wealth, their hidden power, and their catastrophic persecution all seem to point back to the possibility that they were protectors of something far more valuable than mere gold. Could it have been the bloodline of Christ's daughters, still alive beneath the layers of history? To keep such a great secret means living in constant silence. The noble families who may have harbored this lineage could never have openly declared it. Instead, they preserved it through symbols, intricate coats of arms, allegories in art, and stories told by the hearth. Each generation passed this burden to the next, never fully telling the truth, but never allowing it to entirely die. And so the guardianship continued, quiet, invisible, buried in marriages and political alliances, whispered within monastic walls and grand castles. Perhaps the most astonishing of all miracles is not the mere probability of a sacred bloodline existing, but rather its remarkable ability to survive through centuries. This line of descendants remained hidden in plain sight, protected by those who understood its true power and significance. It was passed down from generation to generation by families deeply convinced that the memory of Christ's daughters was too sacred to ever be erased from history or forgotten. Among the countless rumors and secret narratives about Christ's alleged descendants, no name resonates with such clarity and intriguing power as that of the Merovingians. This celebrated dynasty became the first great ruling power of the Franks, shaping the destiny of Gaul during the early Middle Ages. Their monarchs ascended to the throne not by Rome's blessing, but by a mystical aura of sacred legitimacy that surrounded them. They were often called long-haired kings, rois chevelus, as it was widely believed that their luxurious, flowing locks were the source of their otherworldly power, embodying a living symbol of their divine right to rule nations. But where did this deep sense of divine election originate? The Church, for its part, viewed the Merovingians with apprehension. These rulers were not the product of papal coronation and were not entirely subject to Rome's control. Nevertheless, their subjects bestowed upon them a profound reverence and loyalty that seemed to significantly surpass ordinary monarchical rule. Ancient traditions claimed that the Merovingians were able to heal with a touch, that they possessed mysterious mystical powers, and that their dominion was consecrated not by men, but by something far more ancient, profound, and sacred. It is here that the hypothesis arises, inextricably linking them to the figure of Mary Magdalene. Some researchers suggest that the Merovingians, who became widely known in the 5th century, could have been direct descendants of Christ's hidden bloodline, which is believed to have been brought to France through Mary Magdalene and her daughters. If this hypothesis is true, then their dynasty represented not just a political entity, it was a sacred phenomenon. Their power stemmed not from ecclesiastical hierarchy, but directly from the living blood of Christ himself. Such an interpretation can shed light on many questions. It would explain why the Merovingians so stubbornly resisted Rome's omnipotence, why their right to the throne seemed unshakable and inviolable, and why their ultimate decline occurred not as a result of popular will, but as a consequence of betrayal and insidious manipulations by the papacy and rival dynasties. Contemporary chroniclers often vaguely hinted at their extraordinary origins. For instance, the legend of King Merivesh, whose name gave the entire dynasty its appellation, tells of his miraculous conception and birth. According to tradition, his mother, while bathing in the sea, was visited by a mysterious creature, and soon after, Merivesh was born. Historians traditionally dismissed this narrative as merely a myth, yet perhaps it served as a kind of code, an allegory for a bloodline that could not be publicly declared. If the Merovingians indeed carried the blood of the daughters, then their lineage would have been the closest in Europe to the dynasty of Christ. In such a case, their royal thrones would have transformed into sacred altars, and their crowns would have become symbols not only of temporal dominion, but of true divine heritage. It is no wonder that Rome so persistently sought their overthrow. By the 8th century, the Merovingians were supplanted on the historical stage by the Carolingians. Their once powerful legacy waned, and their dynastic line was believed to have ended. Nevertheless, rumors about their true fate did not subside. Some quietly whispered that their descendants survived in strict secrecy, and their lineage continued through marital alliances with noble European houses, silently passed down from generation to generation through centuries. And always in the background, the same question invariably lingers. Were the Merovingians merely characters from ancient traditions? Or did they represent something far more significant? Were they a hidden continuation of the story the Church so diligently sought to consign to oblivion? The story of Christ's daughters, whose destinies may have intertwined with the roots of Europe's royal dynasties. The answer to these questions remains shrouded in silence. But perhaps the very persistence of this legend through the centuries is compelling enough evidence. For why else would the memory of the Merovingians possess such a magnetic and captivating resonance, if not because they held within them the echo of a forbidden heritage, passed down from the depths of ages? What if the idea of the Holy Grail as a cup was fundamentally mistaken? Ancient traditions tell of valiant knights who embarked on a quest for a sacred vessel. This could have been the cup in which, according to belief, Christ's blood was collected at the crucifixion, or the one from which he drank at the Last Supper. However, some argue that this tale is merely a clever veil, an ingenious disguise for something incomparably more mysterious. The true Grail, they suggest, was not a material object, but a living bloodline. Not an artifact of stone or precious metal, but the womb of a woman who bore his heirs. The term sang real, universally translated today as Holy Grail, quite likely once held a different meaning, sang royal blood. Over centuries, the original meaning gradually blurred, shifting from the concept of a living bloodline to the image of a cup, from the figure of a woman to the symbol of a chalice. However, by turning to the earliest, barely perceptible hints, one might surmise that the Grail perhaps represented Magdalene herself, the sacred vessel who bore Christ's children in exile. And if so, the quest for the Grail was never a search for an artifact. It was the preservation of a whole family, the protection of daughters in whose veins flowed both human fragility and divine heritage. Such an interpretation lends a sinister yet intriguing nuance to medieval chivalric romances. Recall the images of knights who journeyed through dense forests and barren deserts in search of the Grail. Their arduous trials, their utmost secrecy, their unwavering devotion, was all this not part of a grand mission of preservation? Were they not acting as guardians of a sacred truth, seeking not an inanimate object, but living heirs who held within them the mystery of divine incarnation itself? And what about the Grail's connection to healing? In every narrative, the discovery of the Grail signifies the resurgence of life, the healing of a wounded land, the rectification of all that has been broken. Could this be a metaphor for the bloodline itself? The idea that the daughters contained not only the direct continuation of Christ, but also the potential for world renewal, for restoring the lost balance between the divine, feminine, and masculine principles that had been suppressed for so long. To think of the Grail as a mere cup is a relatively safe narrative. It reduces this great mystery to a material relic, an object that can be found, consecrated, or conversely, lost. However, if one imagines the Grail as a womb, as a daughter, as a living, continuous bloodline, then this representation becomes extremely dangerous. For no church doctrine could ever accept such a grand truth. No religious hierarchy would be capable of mediating its understanding. If the Grail were truly embodied in flesh, then salvation itself would be beyond Rome's control, contained within women who carried a bloodline too sacred for official recognition. Is it any wonder, then, that ancient legends were rewritten and the Grail transformed into a cup, a sacred vessel of stone, instead of remaining a dangerous truth tied to flesh and blood? All of this was done to conceal the daughters. The original story was transformed, its deeper meanings buried under layers of allegories, and its original symbols carefully disguised. And yet, despite all efforts, the symbols continue to whisper silently. The cup, the rose, the womb-shaped vessel carved in cathedral stones, the Grail maiden who appears in old tales, offering her mysterious gift to the worthy knight. All these elements may well be mere scattered fragments of a memory too profound and powerful to be entirely erased. A memory that the true Grail was never a relic to be found, but a bloodline to be protected. And so, when we speak of the Grail today, we may not be discussing what we usually think of at all. We are likely speaking of Magdalene, of her daughters, of a mystery preserved not in stone or sacred scriptures, but in flesh and blood, hidden in plain sight. If the Grail was more than a mere cup, then how was this truth preserved? Not through open words, for such declarations would inevitably lead to accusations of heresy, exile, or even death. Instead, the story may have been carefully encrypted in codes, skillfully woven into ancient manuscripts, subtly illuminated in symbols, and whispered through allegories. The medieval world harbored a particular passion for symbols, and the scribes who worked on texts often embedded hidden messages within them, concealing forbidden truths beneath multiple layers of meaning. Some medieval codices contain curious passages, verses that seem strangely placed, illustrations that appear unnecessary, and patterns that repeat without apparent reason. For the layman, all of this was mere ornamentation. For the initiated, however, these may have been signals, signs that fragments of the story of Christ's daughters lay hidden within those pages. Consider, for example, the extraordinary prevalence of rose and chalice imagery in High Middle Ages manuscripts. The rose, with its petals curling inward, often served as a symbol of sacred femininity. The chalice, with its womb-like shape, was a vessel of life. When scribes depicted them together, were they merely decorating the margins of manuscripts, or were they encoding a truth too dangerous to write openly? The truth was that Christ's bloodline continued through a woman and through her daughters, not yet acknowledged by the world. Secret codes were not limited to manuscripts. They appeared in architecture, in the very stones of great cathedrals such as Chartres and Notre Dame, and in hidden chapels across Europe. Stained glass and carved reliefs silently whisper of the divine feminine. Figures of Magdalene, often skillfully disguised as unnamed saints, gaze from church windows, her presence simultaneously denied and immortalized. And there were also allegories, medieval romances told of knights seeking maidens, of vessels lost and secrets rediscovered. These tales may have served as coded narratives, preserving memory not in sacred scriptures, but in popular traditions. For the common folk, it was merely entertainment. For those who possessed knowledge, it was a safeguarding, a way to pass on a secret without ever speaking its name aloud. The Codex was both a book and a lock. Words alone could not contain such a dangerous truth. But hidden in the ornamentation, in the initial letters, in the depictions of grapevines and roses, a reader with eyes to see might catch a glimpse of what was forbidden. Why risk creating such complex codes at all? Because silence, though powerful, cannot suppress memory forever. Those who believed in the daughters of Christ could not allow this story to disappear completely. They encoded it, hid it, wrapped it in allegory, trusting that someday someone would decipher it again. And perhaps we are deciphering it even now. Every strange image in a medieval codex, every inexplicable figure in a cathedral window, every story of maidens and vessels in romantic literature, all of these may be fragments of a hidden archive, a library of whispers, preserved not by words, but by symbols. What if, across Europe, we walk past undeniable evidence of Christ's daughters every day, carved in stone, painted on glass, hidden in books, surviving centuries? What if the story was never destroyed, but merely veiled, waiting for us to read it again? If the Grail was not a cup, but a bloodline, what then of the children themselves? The legends of Languedoc, that strange and haunting land of southern France, speak in riddles of sisters, two young women whose origins are shrouded in deep silence. Their names are rarely mentioned, their faces never depicted, yet stories of them persist. Magdalene did not arrive in France alone. She came with daughters. In some tales, they are presented as twins, mirror images of each other, embodying balance, the sacred duality of flesh and spirit, body and soul. To carry both into exile meant carrying forward not only the blood of Christ, but also the harmony of a lineage rooted in the feminine principle. Whispers suggest they grew up not in palaces, but in obscurity, hidden among shepherds, perhaps raised in villages where their true names were never spoken aloud. They were carefully guarded by those initiated into their great secret. Silence surrounded their existence, for if it had been revealed, it would undoubtedly have undermined the established order of the entire Christian world. And yet, if these figures remained in the shadows, they could ensure the continuity of his legacy in physical form. What ultimately happened to them? Some traditions say they were married into noble families, and their bloodline subtly blended into the genealogies of local rulers. Others stubbornly claim they were taken to inaccessible mountains, where they were secretly raised by those who later became known as the Cathars, or Pure Ones, who deeply revered Magdalene as a bearer of hidden wisdom. The image of these enigmatic sisters has reappeared repeatedly throughout the centuries in the region's art and folklore. Two roses, skillfully carved in stone, serve as silent testimony to their presence. Two maidens, placed side by side in stained glass, seem to guard a secret. Two mysterious figures accompanying Magdalene in medieval tales raise questions. Was it merely a coincidence, a twist of fate, or was there an encrypted code behind it? A symbol of daughters, skillfully hidden in an allegorical narrative. The Church never spoke a word about them, but this silence itself is eloquent. For if such daughters had never existed, why would generations of villagers have whispered their story from mouth to mouth? Why would troubadours compose songs about maidens who guarded the secret of a holy bloodline? Why would artists repeatedly return to the motif of two sisters, as if some inner force compelled them to preserve a memory so fragile that it could not be named directly? Perhaps these sisters were not merely beings of flesh and blood, but symbols of something far more significant. They could represent the duality of a sacred heritage, hidden and revealed, forgotten and preserved. One sister, perhaps, remained in the memory of legends, while the other was erased from history, like countless women throughout the centuries. And yet, even the faintest whisper of them continues to keep them alive. The story of the two sisters may never be definitively proven. Their names will likely never be returned to humanity. However, in the stones of Languedoc, in the folklore of Provence, in the symbols carved in churches that stand to this day. Their memory lives on. Perhaps they were real. Perhaps they were merely a myth. Or perhaps both. This is a story born of truth, wrapped in allegory, passed down in silence, so that even now, centuries later, we can still catch their faint voices, the voices of Christ's hidden daughters. If Magdalene's daughters indeed survived in the hills of France, who then protected them from the all-seeing eye of Rome? The Cathars, those mysterious pure ones of Languedoc, may well have been their guardians. Emerging in the 12th century, they dared to challenge the Church's authority, preaching a hidden wisdom, a faith older than Rome's, and a reverence for the feminine principle that clearly violated the patriarchal order. The Cathars held a belief in two realms, one of spirit, the other of decay. They categorically rejected the luxury of the clergy, preferring to live simply, often in deep secrecy. They elevated women to equals, and sometimes even to spiritual leaders, which the Church, of course, condemned as heresy. And in their deep veneration of Mary Magdalene, some perceive something more than mere piety. They sense a memory. Could it be that the Cathars preserved not just her teachings, but her bloodline? The villages of Occitania, where Catharism flourished, remarkably coincide with the regions where legends of Magdalene are still alive. The caves of Saint-Baume, the shores of Provence, the hills of Languedoc, all are places where the memory of her presence is preserved. For the Cathars, she was not a repentant sinner, but a holy teacher, perhaps even the Grail itself. If they knew of her daughters, they would have seen themselves as protectors, chosen to guard this secret from Rome's relentless persecution. The Church's response was ruthless. The Albigensian crusade of the 13th century aimed at the complete annihilation of the Cathars. Pope Innocent III declared them enemies of Christ, sending armies to burn their cities, slaughter their people, and erase their faith from history. Entire towns were destroyed in the name of eradicating heresy. At Béziers, the Crusaders asked how to distinguish heretic from faithful, and were given the infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Why such fury? Perhaps because the Cathars preserved something more than just a faith. Perhaps because they carried a memory too dangerous for Rome, the whisper of Christ's daughters, of a living bloodline hidden among them. If even a rumor of such a truth had persisted, it would have undermined the entire edifice of church authority. In their last stronghold at Montségur, the Cathars resisted until 1244, when the fortress fell and hundreds were burned alive. However, legend tells of a small group who escaped during the night, carrying away a treasure. The nature of this treasure has never been revealed. Some say it was gold, others manuscripts, still others the Grail itself. But if the Grail was not a cup, what did they carry? Perhaps it was knowledge. Perhaps it was a genealogy. Perhaps it was the living heirs of Magdalene's daughters, spirited away into secrecy again, hidden where Rome could never reach. The Cathars were destroyed, but their memory lives on, like an unhealed wound in the history of France. And in their history, we can catch faint outlines of a role greater than heresy. They may have been the last open guardians of a secret bloodline. A bloodline erased by fire, but not extinguished. For blood does not burn, and memory once carried into exile has a way of surviving. High in the Pyrenees, on a solitary peak, stand the majestic ruins of Montségur. For the Church, it was a fortress of heretics. For legend, the last refuge of a secret. In 1244, after many months of siege, Montségur fell. 200 Cathar believers, refusing to recant their faith, were led down the mountain and burned alive on a massive wooden pyre. The flames consumed them, and with them, the last visible stronghold of the Cathar faith, or so it seemed. But even as the fortress fell, the story persisted that on the night before the final surrender, a handful of Cathars slipped through the siege lines, carrying with them a hidden treasure. No gold, no precious stones, nothing the church would recognize as true wealth was ever found among the ruins. This circumstance inevitably raises the question, what then did these people carry with them? Some researchers suggest it was sacred scriptures, ancient texts that held knowledge rapidly being erased from humanity's memory by Rome. Others quietly whisper of a relic, an object whose antiquity surpassed even that of Montségur itself, and still others assert that it was not an object, but a living person, a direct heir to a secret lineage. For if the Cathars were indeed the guardians of Christ's unseen bloodline, then Montségur was not merely a fortification. It became a cradle, a refuge where memories were carefully preserved, where the whisper of Magdalene's daughters was passed down from generation to generation for centuries. And when the fires of the Inquisition blazed, it is quite probable that the guardians ensured that the most precious was carried away under the cover of night. The flames that rose over Montségur were meant to destroy. Their purpose was to silence. They were meant to completely wipe it from the face of the earth. However, fire does not always merely consume. Sometimes it can illuminate. And in the tragedy of the Cathar burning, a legend was born that never truly faded. Even today, pilgrims make the steep ascent to the ruins of Montségur. They stand among the ancient stones, listening to the wind whistling across the mountain slopes. Some claim to feel an unseen presence there, as if the memory of the fallen is still alive. Others speak of a faint whisper carried on the air, reminding them that secrets do not die in flames. What was the last flame of Montségur? Was it merely the flame of martyrdom? Or was it the light of a hidden bloodline, passed on in silence? Did the treasure escape that night, hidden forever in secluded valleys and forgotten villages, awaiting the moment when the world would be ready to remember it again? We cannot know for certain. But perhaps the true treasure of Montségur was never meant to be found. Perhaps its purpose was to survive, not as an object of possession, but as a memory, as a bloodline, as a whisper of daughters whose existence was too dangerous to speak aloud. The ashes of Montségur still rest in the soil of France, and in those ashes, some believe, the secret of Christ's hidden bloodline still smolders, patiently waiting for the winds of curiosity to fan it into a bright flame once more. If the treasure of Montségur was carried away, where could its memory have been preserved? One should look for it not in golden vaults or majestic Roman cathedrals, but among the stones of forgotten chapels, in the delicate carvings of monasteries, in the silent geometry of medieval architecture. For stone, unlike fragile parchment, is not easily burned, and many sincerely believe that those who guarded the secret of Christ's daughters left their testimony etched in stone. Throughout southern France, in churches dedicated to Magdalene, one can find unusual carvings. Here are two roses, placed side by side. Here is a chalice, shaped like a womb. Here are two maidens holding a single crown. To ordinary believers, these details might seem merely ornamental, but to the initiated, they could be fragments of memory, coded reminders of a bloodline too sacred to speak aloud. Consider, for example, the crypt of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume. It is believed to house the relics of Magdalene herself. Its walls whisper with symbols, roses, grapevines, and female figures not mentioned in Scripture. Some scholars tend to dismiss these as mere decorative elements. Others, however, wonder if they are not a silent testimony, traces of daughters whose names were never recorded, but whose presence has been remarkably preserved. The Templars also left their unseen mark in stone. In the chapels they built across Europe, curious images appear: knights kneeling before a mysterious woman, two figures guarding a central flame, hidden roses intricately engraved on arches. Were these merely artistic flourishes of medieval art? Or were they signals of guardianship, quiet affirmations of a bloodline they swore to protect? Even the magnificent cathedrals of Notre Dame hold their secrets. Among the multitude of gargoyles and saints, one can find figures of women whose identities remain unclear and whose gestures hint at hidden roles. Could it be that the very buildings we pass daily in silence are a kind of stone library, where each carving is a page in the book of a forgotten bloodline? The builders of the past knew what could not be expressed in words. Parchment could be burned, names erased, sermons rewritten, but stone withstands the tests of time. Stone remembers, stone waits patiently. And in the shadows of monasteries, in the faces of statues, in the alignment of windows oriented by the stars, perhaps the truth was preserved in plain sight for those who truly wished to see it. What if every church dedicated to Magdalene is more than just an expression of devotion? What if it is a marker, a kind of map, pointing to a bloodline once hidden in these valleys and hills? What if the very architecture of Europe is a complex code, a whole network of symbols left by those who could not speak openly but refused to let history be forgotten? Stone cannot speak, but it can whisper. And in that whisper, some believe, lies the memory of Christ's hidden daughters, erased by Rome, but forever preserved in the silent testimony of stone. If the Cathars perished in the flames, and the guardianship of Christ's bloodline seemed lost, who then took up the mantle of protection? The answer, some believe, lies with the Knights Templar. Founded in the 12th century as warrior monks to protect pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem, the Templars quickly amassed colossal wealth, significant power, and became shrouded in a dense veil of secrecy. For an entire century, they exercised unchallenged authority over vast territories, possessing not only hidden knowledge, but also influence capable of rivaling the might of kings. Their astonishingly rapid rise remained a mystery to historians for many years. Where did their colossal wealth originate? What granted them such unprecedented power, which was feared and envied even by the most powerful monarchs of the time? There is a theory whispered from mouth to mouth, speaking of an astonishing discovery. In ancient Jerusalem, deep beneath the ruined remains of Solomon's temple, the Knights Templar are said to have conducted intensive excavations in labyrinthine underground tunnels. Ancient chronicles hint that their search was not for ordinary gold treasures, but for something immeasurably more significant. Some researchers suggest they managed to uncover invaluable documents, sacred relics, or ancient genealogical records directly related to the very origins of Christianity. Others hold the view that the Templars found irrefutable evidence of Christ's bloodline. Perhaps it was a record of Mary Magdalene and her daughters, carefully preserved in deep secrecy since their exile in time immemorial. If this hypothesis is correct, then the Templars undoubtedly transcended the role of mere warriors, becoming guardians of a forbidden and extraordinarily dangerous heritage. Their mysterious seal, depicting two knights riding a single horse, is often interpreted as a symbol of duality, perhaps even as an indication of the very twin daughters rumored in the Languedoc region. Their bright red cross, strikingly prominent on a pristine white background, symbolizes a sacred and unbreakable union of blood and spiritual purity. One cannot overlook their highly unusual relationship with the Church. Initially receiving full approval and support from the papacy, the knights soon became too powerful and excessively independent, causing concern in Rome. By the beginning of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France, burdened by significant debts to the order, decided to completely destroy the Templars. With reluctant papal blessing, the knights were accused of heresy, subjected to mass arrests, brutal torture, and ultimately burned at the stake. Why such unthinkable cruelty? Was it merely greed, a king's simple desire to seize their untold riches? Or was something far deeper and more sinister hidden behind these actions? Could the Templars have been guardians of a truth so dangerous that its revelation was absolutely unthinkable? It concerned the survival of Christ's bloodline, which might still have existed, still been preserved, beyond Rome's reach and control. It is said that, on the night preceding their mass arrest in 1307, some Templars managed to make a daring escape, carrying with them certain treasures that were never found. Some believe it was ordinary gold. Others, however, assert that it was the legendary Grail. But if the Grail was actually a bloodline, then perhaps they carried not a material object, but a memory or even living descendants of Christ's hidden heirs. Even after the complete annihilation of the order, their secret managed to survive. The Templar legacy transformed into legends, becoming a source of inspiration for numerous secret societies, encrypted symbols, and whispering connections to subsequent orders. Some researchers claim that the Freemasons, centuries later, inherited fragments of their guardianship. Others insist that the Templars never truly disappeared, but merely went underground, continuing their silent protection of a lineage that the Church so desperately tried to erase from the face of the earth. The Templars are remembered as valiant warriors, skilled bankers, and branded heretics. But perhaps, in reality, they were something far greater. Perhaps they were the guardians of the daughters, the guardians of that very bloodline that could never be spoken aloud, but which could also never be destroyed. And if so, their silence is not a sign of absence. It is, rather, a shield. A silence that still carefully guards a mystery, awaiting its hour of revelation. If the Templars indeed guarded the secret of Christ's hidden heirs, why did the Church turn against them so cruelly and mercilessly? The answer to this question may lie not only in banal greed, but in a deep, all-consuming fear. For if a bloodline originating from Magdalene truly survived, Rome's very power would be threatened with complete destruction. The papacy's claims were based on the conviction that it was the sole and infallible representative of Christ on earth. But if his descendants still walked among people, heirs of flesh and blood carrying his lineage, then the Pope would not be his vicar, but his direct rival. This is why the betrayal was swift and ruthless. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France delivered the first devastating blow. With papal permission, he ordered the sudden arrest of every Templar in his kingdom. Throughout Europe, knights were dragged from their commanderies, chained, subjected to horrific torture, and accused of blasphemy. They were accused of spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and heresy. However, beneath these accusations, the inevitable question arises: were they truly guilty of a certain secrecy that remains misunderstood to this day? Perhaps the true heresy of the Templars lay not in what they believed, but in what they knew. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, but not before cursing both the king and the pope, declaring that they would soon face God's judgment. Indeed, both men died within a year of the curse. For some, it was merely a coincidence. For others, an undeniable sign that the Templars carried with them not only secrets, but a divine mandate, a protection that even the most destructive fire could not erase. What if the accusations of heresy were merely a clever disguise for a deeper, fundamental fear? What if Rome feared that the Templars had discovered or even harbored the descendants of Christ's daughters? What if these descendants lived quietly in France, skillfully woven into noble houses, guarded by knights who had sworn to keep this secret? This would explain the incredible brutality of their suppression. This would explain why the papacy, usually so cautious, acted with such determination to completely wipe them from the face of the earth. For the very existence of Christ's bloodline would destroy the foundation upon which the Church rests. It was about salvation achieved through an institution mediated by priests, not through the living presence of his heirs. However, silence does not always guarantee success. The destruction of the Templars may have burned their order, but it could not incinerate the bloodline they so faithfully protected. If the daughters survived, they would undoubtedly already be hidden, merged with families whose names aroused absolutely no suspicion. Thus, the alleged betrayal directed against the Order of the Templars may have only superficially succeeded, leaving Rome triumphant in the eyes of the world, but powerless in the face of a far deeper legacy connected to blood and origin. History, as is known, remembers the Templars as martyrs who fell victim to the greed and envy of monarchs. However, there is a suggestion that their true betrayal lay in something else, something that chronicles could never reveal. It was the betrayal of those who carefully preserved a truth too dangerous for humanity to be disclosed. This truth was suppressed by the flames of pyres and false accusations, yet it was passed on in whispers, beyond the reach of omnipresent Rome. And perhaps, even today, humanity continues to live under the shadow of this ancient, hidden betrayal. A pertinent question arises: why has the Vatican, that eternal keeper of archives whose antiquity surpasses any earthly kingdom, remained so silent regarding these mysterious whispers of blood and lineage? Deep beneath majestic Rome, in vaults rumored to stretch for many kilometers, lie manuscripts, ancient codices, and scrolls, carefully hidden from curious eyes. Some date back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. Others are letters, gospels, and testaments that were declared apocryphal, too dangerous to support the official church narrative. If Christ's bloodline truly existed, if Magdalene's daughters left even the slightest evidence of their being, Could these proofs not be found precisely here, buried under countless layers of centuries-old secrecy? For many centuries, the Church meticulously shaped collective memory. Certain texts were elevated to canonical status. Others were strictly forbidden from circulation and study. Gnostic Gospels, which spoke of Magdalene as Christ's direct companion, were decisively excluded from the official corpus. Entire traditions of early Christianity were condemned as heresy. And each such choice inexorably shaped what we were allowed to remember and what we were instructed to forget. Why did this happen? Perhaps the reason lies in the fact that acknowledging the existence of Christ's bloodline would shatter centuries of theological constructs. For if Christ had direct heirs, the line between mortal and divine would blur. Salvation would then flow not only through sacraments, through the mediation of priests and popes, but through the lives of his direct descendants. The Church's power would inevitably be undermined. Its might, built on mediating grace, would cease to be absolute and unquestionable. This is precisely why silence seemed the safer path. It was far preferable to preserve the image of Magdalene as a repentant sinner, perpetually bowed in deep remorse, rather than to acknowledge her as the mother of daughters in whose veins flowed the blood of Christ. It was better to secure her status as forgiven than to remember her as the vessel of his lineage and the bearer of his genetic heritage. It was far wiser to conceal even the very possibility that the Holy Grail was not merely a cup, but a womb that contained the future. However, this very silence eloquently tells its own story. After every act of erasure, elusive traces remain. After every forbidden gospel, at least a fragment of truth survives. After every decree of suppression, a legend continues to live in village traditions, in works of art, in the songs of troubadours who skillfully wove memory into their poetry. If the Vatican consciously chose the path of silence, it is only because there was something significant that required suppression. Whispers tell stories of sealed documents, locked away for centuries, known only to the highest church hierarchs, of gospels detailing Christ's companions, of genealogical records tracing bloodlines in distant Gaul. There are also reports of sects, such as the Cathars, who spoke too freely and openly about Magdalene. Are these stories merely products of fantasy? Or are they echoes of those very papers, hidden in deep darkness and guarded with special care, because they reveal too much? The Vatican may never decide to reveal what exactly is stored in its vast archives. Silence may continue silently for many more centuries, but silence cannot erase memory. It only plunges the mystery even deeper into impenetrable gloom. And so we are left with questions that the Vatican stubbornly refuses to answer. Questions buried in shadows, silent in corridors lined with parchment and the dust of centuries. Did Christ leave daughters? Did Magdalene carry them into exile, saving them from persecution? Do their descendants still walk among us, unnoticed in the crowd? The Vatican remains silent, but that very silence whispers ceaselessly. If the Vatican chose silence, it also chose fire. The Inquisition, born in the 12th century and refined in subsequent centuries, became the sharpest blade of ecclesiastical control. Its task was exceedingly simple: to track down heresy, ruthlessly suppress any dissent, and erase from the face of the earth any faith that deviated even slightly from the doctrine chosen and affirmed by Rome. However, beneath this noble mission of preserving the purity of faith lay another, far more sinister question. What truths, precisely, were being persecuted? The Cathars, as we have seen, were annihilated with unprecedented cruelty. Mystics who spoke too freely and openly about Magdalene were silenced. Scholars who studied apocryphal texts too long and too closely were condemned. Families rumored to possess unusual genealogies suddenly found themselves under suspicion. What if the endless flames of the Inquisition burned not only in the name of theology, but in the name of blood, for the sake of preserving the purity of certain bloodlines? The hidden daughters of Christ, if they truly existed, could never be officially recognized. Their revelation would inevitably destroy the very foundation of church power. And so, if even a faint whisper arose, if anyone dared to suggest that Christ's bloodline was still present among people, the Inquisition was immediately brought to full readiness. Accusations were made swiftly, often on the most trivial pretexts. A recounted dream, a symbol drawn in the margins of a book, or a family's connection to lands once inhabited by Cathars. The accused were mercilessly dragged to dungeons, where they were tortured until a confession was extracted. Their words were then used for their own condemnation. This was inevitably followed by the fire of the pyres. Silence was enforced by force, crude and merciless. It is said that entire libraries were destroyed. The burned manuscripts may have contained traces of long-forgotten gospels or genealogical records that linked noble families to Gaul, to Magdalene, to Christ himself. What knowledge turned to ash? What names were lost forever, irrevocably? A curious paradox is observed in the very nature of suppression. The more zealously certain forces try to consign certain information or phenomena to oblivion, the more tenaciously that information or phenomenon becomes entrenched in collective memory. Thus, for example, quiet traditions of something forbidden found refuge in folk tales, passed down orally. Hidden symbols continued to live on in works of art, remaining unnoticed by the uninitiated. Bloodlines harboring important secrets were guarded within noble families, where they were passed down from generation to generation in the strictest secrecy, avoiding written records to leave no material evidence. The Inquisition, possessing immense power, could burn human bodies and vast libraries, but it was powerless to destroy the very blood that flowed in the veins of descendants. Thus, the mere existence of such a powerful punitive apparatus as the Inquisition unequivocally indicated a deeply rooted, carefully concealed fear of something that could not be completely eradicated. A legitimate question arises. Why was such a large-scale use of force and fire necessary to protect a faith that was already considered immutable and universally accepted? Why so much destruction and cruelty if, according to the official version, there was nothing worthy of concealment? Perhaps the true reason lay not only in the Church's fight against heresy, but also in its desire to consign certain pages of history to oblivion. The echoes of the Inquisition's smoke are still felt in Europe's historical memory today. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Many names vanished into obscurity, and dissenting voices were silenced forever. And yet, one of the truths that was so zealously attempted to be buried, the hypothetical possibility of Christ's descendants through the female line, stubbornly refuses to remain buried beneath centuries of silence. For absolute, perfect silence, as experience shows, is practically unattainable. Even the cooled ashes of past events, when disturbed by a random gust of wind, can begin to whisper quietly, revealing long-forgotten secrets. What if the fundamental truth was not irrevocably lost, but merely cleverly disguised, hidden in plain sight? It is known that throughout the medieval period across Europe, noble and aristocratic families meticulously maintained their genealogical records. Scrolls containing detailed family trees were carefully copied and preserved, allowing for the tracing of an unbroken chain of ancestors through numerous generations of lords and ladies, princes and princesses. Such historical records served not only as a source of family pride and testament to ancient lineage, but also as a powerful tool of legitimization. They were irrefutable proof of the right to inheritance, to vast landholdings, and to claims of political power. Nevertheless, some of these genealogies raise questions due to their strange incompleteness. Certain lines break off for no apparent reason. Others contain curious symbols in their margins, images of roses, chalices, doubled figures, signs that give the impression not merely of decorative elements, but rather of quiet, barely perceptible reminders of something important. Is it not possible that fragments of Christ's carefully concealed bloodline could have been preserved precisely in these ancient family trees? As an example, consider the dynasties that flourished in the southern regions of France, many of which demonstrated persistent resistance to Rome's authority and managed to maintain an extraordinary degree of independence. Their family trees sometimes rooted in a very mysterious, shadowy origin, pointing to ancestors whose biographies were described in extremely vague or purely symbolic terms. The question arises, was this merely a consequence of the natural fading of historical memory? Or did it represent a deliberately created veil of secrecy? Could these noble families have assimilated the descendants of hypothetical daughters, thereby infusing sacred blood into their own lineage, while carefully guarding this truth from the Church's watchful and vigilant eye? Marriage in this context could have served as an ideal form of disguise. A supposed daughter of Christ could have been married to a member of an influential family, and her own name would thus be lost to official history. However, her blood would continue to flow through the veins of dukes, counts, and eventually even kings, preserving its hidden significance. Openly mentioning or documenting such an unusual origin would undoubtedly have posed a mortal threat to those who dared to do so. A much safer path was to conceal this information under a veil of allegories, through the use of symbols, enigmatic notes, or subtle, barely noticeable emblems. It is highly noteworthy that on some family crests, one can find images of roses skillfully intertwined with chalices, or stars connected with crescent moons. These images, being entirely foreign to traditional Christian heraldry, nevertheless stubbornly persisted in the symbolism of certain regions and families. For most uninformed observers, these symbols were perceived as mere ornamentation, a decorative element. However, for those initiated into the mysteries, they may have served as quiet yet unambiguous affirmations, indicating that the hidden blood continued to flow. Even in the poetry of troubadours, those medieval singers and poets, one can find hints of long-forgotten genealogies. Songs belonging to the tradition of courtly love often tell of maidens who were guardians of divine secrets, or of noble ladies metaphorically described as roses blooming in deep secrecy, whose true value remained hidden from all but the most devoted and loyal knight. If the Church rigidly controlled official chronicles and annals, private families, in turn, maintained control over their own internal memory. In high castles and impregnable fortresses, stories were whispered in secluded rooms where no inquisitor could penetrate. These traditions were likely preserved precisely in this way. Never being written down, they were always spoken aloud, always passed to the next generation as an unspoken legacy. Thus, despite many genealogical lines appearing outwardly broken or severed, there is a possibility that the true bloodline was never actually interrupted. It is not excluded that the kings and queens of subsequent centuries might unconsciously have carried Christ's blood in their veins. Could numerous dynasties established across Europe have arisen not only through military conquests or political marriages, but also through the inheritance of this sacred bloodline, which was so carefully expunged from official historical records? We cannot assert this with full certainty. However, the presence of so many missing links in European genealogies suggests something far more significant than simple human forgetfulness. These gaps, rather, point to a deliberate erasure of information. And such erasure, as a rule, testifies to the existence of a truth so dangerous that it was forbidden to speak aloud. It is entirely possible that the bloodline of hypothetical daughters of Christ was not completely destroyed, but merely skillfully disguised, and probably by means that we in the modern world are unable to fully trace and understand. This blood still continues to flow, remaining hidden beneath centuries of official ink records, destructive fire, and enforced silence. If noble genealogies could indeed conceal such a significant bloodline, then the next question arises: what about the royal crowns of Europe? For centuries, monarchs, whether kings or queens, confidently asserted their divine right to rule. Some based their legitimacy on papal blessing and church recognition, while others derived it from military conquests and the force of arms. But what if their power was rooted in an entirely different, far more secret and profound reason? What if this hidden bloodline of Christ had long been firmly woven into the fabric of royal houses ruling across Europe? The Merovingian dynasty, about which mysterious whispers circulated, was considered the first heir to this line, but they were perhaps far from the last. Through numerous marriages and political alliances, their descendants mingled with representatives of other influential dynasties, and thus, their sacred blood could have spread to many European thrones and royal courts. By the early medieval period, it was quite possible that ruling kings and queens carried within them a forgotten heritage, based on a claim that possessed far greater power than ordinary papal coronation, a claim rooted in the very body of Christ. Could this very circumstance have been the reason why European monarchs so fiercely and zealously guarded their genealogical records? And why do some of these family trees root in deep myths and legends, as if striving to establish their legitimacy in the misty haze of distant antiquity? Is it possible that this was the reason for the sacred aura possessed by some monarchical crowns, such as the French, which even Rome could not completely overthrow? The idea of a union between Christ's hidden blood and temporal power would undoubtedly have plunged the Church into deep horror. A monarch who could claim descent not merely from noble ancestors, but directly from Christ himself, would be beyond the control of the papacy. His rule would be consecrated by the flesh itself, not merely by a formal sacrament. And if queens were the bearers of this blood, then their children, the numerous princes and princesses of Europe, would become living heirs to a priceless heritage that Rome so zealously sought to erase from memory. Some ancient legends even suggest that the famous Stuart line in Scotland, and later in England, held echoes of this mysterious heritage. Their deep fascination with sacred symbols, their steadfast resistance to Rome's authority, their inherent sense of divine right to the throne. All this could well have been merely a faint echo of that forgotten memory, which they perhaps could never fully comprehend or articulate. Even in France, whispers permeated through the centuries that the Capetian and Bourbon dynasties carried Merovingian blood, which meant something far deeper, a legacy inextricably linked to Magdalene's daughters. Whether these rumors are true or not, the fear of such claims relentlessly haunted Rome, for it meant that legitimate power could arise outside of its blessing. It would be rooted not in papal authority, but in a hidden bloodline that the Church had no means to control. What if the royal courts of Europe actually knew this secret, even if they never openly spoke of it? What if behind all the lavish ceremonies and strict rituals lay a quiet, profound understanding that their legitimacy stemmed not only from military conquests or solemn coronation, but from a sacred origin, carefully preserved for many centuries? If so, then the bloodline of Christ's daughters did not vanish without a trace. It ascended from secluded villages to opulent noble courts, from forgotten genealogies to majestic royal thrones, from deep silence to shining crowns. And perhaps even today, this legacy is preserved not in ancient relics or dusty archives, but in living heirs who, unbeknownst to themselves, walk the earth in the shadow of a long-forgotten heritage. If there is one single place where all these mysterious whispers converge, it is undoubtedly Rennes-le-Château. This small, secluded village in southern France, perched on a solitary hill, holds a secret that has haunted seekers of truth for over a century. In the late 1800s, its parish priest, Béranger Saunière, stumbled upon something that irrevocably changed his entire life. The details of this discovery remain hazy, shrouded in rumors and speculation. Some claim he found ancient parchments cleverly hidden in the church, documents hinting at a bloodline long erased from official history. Others believe he unearthed a treasure, not of gold, but of priceless knowledge, possibly connected to Christ himself and Mary Magdalene. Whatever it was, Saunière suddenly became fabulously wealthy. He renovated his church, adding strange embellishments filled with enigmatic symbols, images of devils, angels, and Magdalene weeping at the foot of the cross. Why did such unusual images appear in a quiet parish, far from the watchful eye of Rome? The answer, some believe, is that Saunière discovered irrefutable evidence of Christ's descendants. Rennes-le-Château is located in the heart of Cathar country, where legends of Magdalene and her daughters have lived and been passed down for centuries. The village itself is nestled in a landscape dotted with ancient ruins, mysterious caves, and chapels once linked to her cult. If the daughters truly lived, if their bloodline was preserved, then this region, remote, mountainous, and fiercely independent, represented an ideal cradle for their heritage. And so the story goes that Saunière, while renovating his church, touched upon a secret that survived the Inquisition, survived Montségur, survived centuries of brutal suppression. His sudden wealth, his enigmatic renovations, his overall secrecy, Were these not all clear signs of a man who stumbled upon a forbidden truth and was perhaps richly paid by unseen hands to keep it deeply confidential? Pilgrims still come to Rennes-le-Château, wandering its narrow streets, carefully examining the strange inscriptions and carvings left by Saunière. They stand before the church of MaryMagdalene, wondering what he found and why he never spoke of it. Some claim the secret still rests in the village, hidden beneath a stone or sealed in secret vaults. Others believe that Saunière passed it on to secret societies, guardians of a bloodline whose existence should never be revealed too openly. And some whisper that Christ's descendants may still walk among us, their lineage quietly traced back to the hills of Rennes. Rennes-le-Château remains an eternal enigma, a nexus of history where treasure, bloodline, and forbidden memory are inextricably intertwined. And perhaps this is entirely fitting. For if Christ's daughters ever lived, if their bloodline truly survived to this day, where else should their legacy rest? If not in a village situated on the border between history and myth, where silence and secrecy have always been the most reliable guardians. Among all the symbols whispered about through the centuries, none speaks of a hidden bloodline more clearly than the rose and the chalice. The rose, long before it became a mere symbol of beauty, was sacred. Its delicate petals curl inward, like a secret, reliably concealing its heart. In medieval traditions, the rose symbolized secrecy. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, meant a truth spoken but never written, a confidence that had to be kept. What better symbol for a bloodline that could never be openly recorded in historical chronicles? The silent testimony, the rose, the chalice, and the hidden legacy. The chalice, this ancient vessel, also holds a multitude of meanings, like a layered narrative unfolding before one's eyes. It appeared before humanity as the Holy Grail, embodying the idea of a divine presence that, according to tradition, became the receptacle of Christ's blood. However, in its very form, in its curves and contours, lies another, deeper truth. It is both a vessel of life and a womb, a symbol of the sacred feminine, revered since time immemorial. The combination of the rose and the chalice, like a faint whisper, tells of Magdalene and her daughters, of that secret womb that gave the world Christ's hidden heirs, whose existence remained in the shadows of history. These two symbols, the rose and the chalice, reappear time and again in various manifestations, like a recurring motif in a grand symphony. They can be found on ancient coats of arms, skillfully carved into the stones of majestic cathedrals, or elegantly drawn in yellowed manuscripts. A rose resting within a chalice crowned with delicate roses, a maiden holding a chalice adorned with petals. To the ordinary, uninitiated eye, all this seems no more than exquisite ornamentation, a decorative element. But for one who possesses knowledge, who can read between the lines and see beyond the surface, these images represent a complex cipher carrying a profound message. Even the secret societies that emerged in Europe after the tragic fall of the Knights Templar chose these emblems as their identifying marks. The Rosicrucians, whose very name spoke of the union of the rose and the cross, openly proclaimed a hidden wisdom, secret knowledge carefully preserved since ancient times. The question arises, did their rose conceal not only a mystical truth, but also the memory of a bloodline, a genealogical line rooted in the distant past? Did the chalice used in their rituals reflect Magdalene's womb, which they may have revered in deep silence, but whose existence was categorically denied by official Rome. And if one considers how often roses appear in majestic cathedrals, these are the enormous rose windows, giant circles of colored glass that shine with unearthly beauty, letting streams of light pass through them. To stand before one of these masterpieces is to experience both awe at their grandeur and an inexplicable mystery. But what if these rose windows are more than just works of art? What if each such window is a silent proclamation, a gigantic wheel of light that announces what cannot be spoken openly? That Christ's legacy lived not only in heaven, but also in blood, passed through daughters on earth, preserved from generation to generation. These symbols continue to exist because they possess an astonishing duality. They both conceal and reveal truth. They are safe to display publicly, for to most they are merely decorations, but they carry a dangerous meaning for those who understand their true significance. They allow memory to be transmitted without words, surviving the fires of the Inquisition, centuries of suppression and oblivion, remaining untouched in their silence. The rose, in its silence, whispers sacred secrets. The chalice, in its apparent emptiness, promises the fullness of being. Together they tell a story that the official church never wanted humanity to hear. And so, when your gaze falls upon a rose window, shining in the rays of the setting sun, or upon a chalice exquisitely carved in ancient stone, pause for a moment to reflect. For perhaps you are not looking at a mere ornament, but at a testimony left to us by those who could not speak openly, but who refused to let memory die. The rose and the chalice. They are the secret and the vessel, Magdalene and her daughters. Perhaps these are the truest symbols of a bloodline that was erased from official chronicles, but never forgotten in the depths of human memory. If the bloodline of Christ's daughters was considered too dangerous for Rome, then perhaps it survived not in open churches, where everyone could see and hear, but in secret fraternities, shrouded in secrecy. After the fall of the Templars, whispers of their knowledge did not disappear without a trace. Instead, it seemed to seep into other orders, into numerous secret groups that arose across Europe, like underground streams. Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and shadowy networks of alchemists and mystics all used symbols that distinctly echoed the old whisper: roses, chalices, stars, and hidden genealogies. Rosicrucians, for example, spoke of the rose and the cross, perceiving them as emblems of hidden wisdom. For them, the rose symbolized secrecy, and the cross, transformation, profound metamorphosis. But could their union also reflect a long-denied marriage, a preserved bloodline that was not openly spoken of? Some researchers believe that the Rosicrucians carried fragments of the Templar legacy, knowledge of a sacred heritage dating back to Magdalene herself. The Freemasons are also shrouded in a dense veil of mystery. They were cathedral builders, masters of symbols, keepers of rituals passed down from generation to generation. Their lodges are adorned with signs of duality, sacred geometry, and veiled allegories. The question arises, did they inherit not only architectural skills, but also a memory encoded in stone? That very memory of Christ's hidden heirs that the Templars once zealously protected. In their rites, the symbols are unambiguous and recognizable. The compass and square, indicating balance and the union of opposites. The letter G, surrounded by a veil of secrecy, is often interpreted as a symbol of geometry or God, but some whisper that it means something else: generation, the mystery of blood, a sacred lineage hidden in the flesh, passed down from century to century. Even alchemists, whose strange formulas and enigmatic experiments enveloped them in a fog of mystery, sought something more than just the transmutation of metals. Their search for the philosopher's stone, promising eternal life hidden within matter, may resonate with the same profound quest: the preservation of a sacred heritage in living form, the transformation of blood into an immortal legacy. What unites all these societies is their deep silence. None of them speak directly, nor openly reveal their secrets. All of them conceal their knowledge in symbols, allegories, and parables. Perhaps this is because the truth they so carefully protect cannot be revealed without destroying the very fabric of the world that surrounds them, without disrupting the established order. Could it be that these secret societies were never merely intellectual circles or guilds of builders, but were guardians, keepers of ancient whispers, entrusted with protecting the most dangerous knowledge of all possible? Could it be that through centuries of wars, suppression, and betrayal, they ensured the preservation of a bloodline, hidden behind masks of rituals and symbols, guarding it from unwanted eyes? Their influence is felt even now, in architecture, in legends, in the quiet power they are rumored to possess. Perhaps they are still watching us, invisibly present in our lives. Perhaps the guardianship never ended, but continues to this day. Perhaps even now, behind closed doors, the story of Christ's daughters is known, their descendants protected, their memory carefully preserved. And if so, the echoes of Magdalene's children still resonate, not in opulent churches, but in societies that flourish in silence, not in sacred scriptures, but in symbols full of deep meaning, not in bright daylight, but in the shadows, where secrets have always found refuge and survived, awaiting their hour. Thus, the narrative returns to the key question with which this intellectual journey, in essence, began. Did the Messiah leave behind female descendants, secret heiresses whose very existence could shatter the foundations of religious doctrine and shake the fundamental pillars of the ecclesiastical worldview? The path of this enigma stretches from the sun-drenched shores of Provence to the majestic yet ruined fortresses of Montségur. It is traced in enigmatic symbols skillfully carved into ancient stone and in carefully hidden secrets buried deep within the impenetrable vaults of the Vatican. It manifests in the meticulously documented genealogies of European noble houses and in the barely perceptible whispers circulating among members of secret societies. This trace, despite all attempts to obliterate it, continues to exist. Each of these threads, seemingly insignificant and fragile individually, is skillfully woven into a vast tapestry of historical evidence that points more to a stubborn memory than to a frivolous myth. Such a story possesses too much credibility and is too widely disseminated to be simply dismissed as mere fiction. Historical evidence indicates that the Church made significant efforts to silence the figure of Magdalene, transforming her image from a wise teacher or an equal follower into that of a repentant sinner. The fierce Inquisition ruthlessly burned at the stake those who dared to revere her or her supposed legacy. The Knights Templar, a powerful and mysterious order, were treacherously betrayed, their structure destroyed, and their sacred secrets, it is believed, were irrevocably lost in the flames of purification. And yet, despite all these repressions, the mysterious whisper continues to echo through the centuries, a whisper of sisters, a whisper of potential heirs, a whisper of a sacred bloodline that was diligently expunged from official chronicles, but never fully eradicated from the collective memory of the world. Perhaps the most compelling evidence, surpassing all others, is the very persistence of this carefully maintained silence. For if there was nothing to hide, why would such colossal efforts have been made to destroy and forget? Why was such furious rage, such all-consuming fire of persecution, such countless centuries of systematic suppression necessary? And why do symbols such as roses and chalices, images of twins, and signs of secret unions continue to constantly appear and intertwine in art, architecture, and rich folklore across Europe? Is it truly possible that the true Grail, sought for centuries, was never a material cup, but was, in essence, a womb, a symbol of life and the continuation of a lineage? Was the most sacred relic of all not an artifact, but life force itself, quietly and subtly passed down from generation to generation through daughters whose names, perhaps, were never recorded in written sources, but whose blood, nevertheless, continues to pulse in the veins of descendants? However, complete and indisputable certainty on this matter is likely impossible to achieve. History, like a silent guardian, has buried too much evidence under the weight of centuries, and those who acted as keepers of this silence did so with exceptional caution and foresight. Perhaps absolute certainty was never meant to be granted to humanity. Perhaps this very overarching mystery is the true legacy, that whisper that tirelessly prompts one to listen deeper, to ask questions, and to strive to understand what lies beneath the surface of the stories traditionally told. For ultimately, the concept of Christ's daughters may have less to do with literal genealogy and more to do with questions of historical memory. It is likely less about physical blood and much more about the boundless possibility and potential of an alternative worldview. They emerge as a powerful symbol of what was carefully hidden from public view, as undeniable evidence of what those in power so greatly feared, and as a profound silence that, paradoxically, can speak far louder than any uttered words. Therefore, as night falls and the surrounding world is enveloped in soothing silence, one might consider taking time to reflect on this profound mystery. It is worth trying to imagine these daughters, invisibly passing through the labyrinths of history, their presence, like a sacred flame, transmitted from one century to another. It is important to honor this barely perceptible whisper, for even if absolute truth remains unattainable for human understanding, history itself, in its relentless flow, has endured, like an unbreakable thread, steadfastly weaving its way through countless centuries of silence and oblivion. It is quite probable that this invisible thread of narrative continues to unravel to this day, stretching through time and space. Perhaps it leads directly into the modern era, connecting the deep past with the present moment. And perhaps one day, when humanity reaches a certain degree of readiness, this truth will be fully revealed and seen in its pristine form. Until then, this profound secret remains unsolved. The hidden daughters of Christ, figures seemingly forgotten by official history, yet despite everything, never completely erased from the collective consciousness of the world.